All right, let's go ahead and get started. I have Sean Walker here from Sky and Telescope magazine, and he's going to give us a talk about the hydrogen sky and the work that he's done with Dennis Chico up in New Hampshire area. You're in New Hampshire, right?
Well, this was all shot in Sudbury, Mass.
Okay.
But up north.
So let's go ahead.
Thanks. What's interesting is transitioning from Tom's talk is this. My talk's a lot about going beyond just taking pretty pictures, and we'll get into that in just a moment. I obviously work at Sky and Telescope with Dennis DeChico, and both of us have been into imaging for a really long time. Dennis was one of the pioneers of deep sky astrophotography and meteor searches, asteroid hunts. Anyway, but one of the things about getting into astrophotography and doing it for a long time is you gotta, keep your interest. You can only shoot M42 so many times before you need something more out of it. And that's how we kind of fell into this project. So Dennis has been photographing the sky for more than 4 decades, pushing 5. And this is his, looking down in his office. I'm just on the other side of the wall behind the bookcase. Anyway, he had shot the NLM, the first person to do that back in 78, 79. This picture kind of made the rounds quite a bit back then. But anyway, with the advent of CCD cameras for amateur astronomy, one of Dennis's big projects, again, was hunting asteroids. And he eventually discovered more than 60 by himself. As part of a group, he's discovered more than 100.
Sorry, Sean.
That's okay. As CCD detectors grew in size, he became enamored by the idea of shooting wide field images to cover not just single little objects, but a bigger region of the sky. This is actually the background here is looking over Dennis's house from his observatory. And we'll get back to this in a second. Note that Orion right over the house. Previously, I had Dennis make an adapter for me to attach my ST8 to a camera lens so I could start doing some mosaics myself. This was one of my first bigger projects, which was a 3-frame mosaic with the 55mm Nikkor lens and hydrogen alpha, green, and blue filter. I was imaging from Methuen, Massachusetts, which isn't terribly far from Boston. It's pretty light polluted. But one way to cut through that, again, is using narrowband filters in combination with broadband color. Generally, the blue and the green are most affected by light pollution. That's why I didn't shoot too much deep color for this one. But anyway, so here's Dennis building one of his many projects. And this was for setting up for doing his imaging up in his observatory. Basically, whenever I need something made that I can't buy somewhere, I ask Dennis, and I bribe him by doing his image processing. So this was one of his recent things. He does a lot of work for, I don't know if you've heard of Ron Dantowitz. He does a lot of high-resolution work for NASA now. He was examining the shuttle during re-entry to measure the heat buildup on the panels so they could develop better protection and avoid the catastrophe of 2003 in the future. Anyway, this was a beam splitter that Dennis had made for Dantowitz. Anyway, so even with relatively small CCDs and 35mm lens, you have a lot of different problems putting images together. First and foremost is vignetting. Camera lenses are made to cover a larger sensor, but you stop them down for daylight photography to get rid of vignetting. Whereas for nighttime photography, you don't want to stop the lens down because it makes your exposures even longer. One way to correct that is to do flat field exposures. The other issue was lens distortion, which we can get back to in a few. The biggest problem, though, is up until recently, most camera lenses had very limited back focus. 35 millimeter lenses only have 55 millimeters between the back of the lens and where it needs to come to focus, limiting what you could put in line, like filter wheels and whatnot. So it kind of made larger lenses than a 35 millimeter format lens were kind of out of the question. Because when CCDs got larger than that, well, they won't cover the corner of the chips. But one thing that was really promising was the old medium format lenses. For one thing, they were really popular up until recently for wedding photography and whatnot. And now that there's really big cameras, digital SLRs, the used market has become flooded with old Hasselblad or Miyama lenses you can get for really cheap. And they have a lot of back focus. This particular one, these are Hasselblad lenses that Dennis machined an adapter for, have about 70 millimeters of back focus. So you can put a filter wheel, even an off-axis guider if necessary in line, and still come to proper focus distance. This was our little setup here, well, Dennis's, and using a Apogee U16. It's got the really big 16 megapixel, 38 by 38 millimeter CCD detector. Anyway, and the lens you see attached to it on the right here is that one particular one was an 85 millimeter lens that we started off doing some tests. He also, before he picked up the 16, he was using a 9000, which you probably saw reviewed in the magazine back in 2008. Anyway, it's the same dimensions but larger pixels. So he was using a variety of lenses to play around. And he would come in with his images in the morning. Compared to the 55 millimeter lens, there was a lot more room, I said that. The Hasselblad lenses also can cover even bigger imaging areas, so we can use a bigger chip. Oh, that's funny. Anyway, the first tests with this 80 millimeter lens that I was mentioning earlier were really encouraging. This is Cassiopeia and Perseus. You probably recognize the Heart and Soul nebulas, and way out on the right over here is the Pac-Man Nebula, Ngc 281. Like, these cover a really big area, and of course, that got us to thinking. So Dennis would start shooting these images each night, and he would show up in the office with fresh data. Both he and I show up rather early to avoid the traffic. About 6:30 in the morning, he'd come in and I'd show up, and we'd be making coffee, and he'd tell me about what he'd be shooting, and he'd give me his flash drive. So by lunchtime, I'd have his image all processed. Anyway, during the summer of 2008, Dennis captured a lot of Milky Way fields with Hasselblad lenses and a 15 nanometer custom-made hydrogen alpha filter designed for film. It didn't have an infrared cutoff, but you put one in line and it only slightly reduced the sensitivity. This is a two-frame mosaic of M16 and M17 right over here, taken with that setup. And they fit together rather seamlessly. The lens distortion also on these Hasselblad lenses are far less than on 35 millimeter lenses for the same reason that it will cover a bigger field. There's less distortions involved. This is a 3-panel mosaic also taken with that U9000 setup. At the bottom here you see IC 1396 in Cepheus, and this is a rather obscure SH2-129. It's I believe it might be a planetary nebula remnant, a really ancient one. Anyway, so I started stitching some of these things together, which again kept picking Dennis's interest. And as the Milky Way in the winter became better placed, Dennis started shooting more and more overlapping areas. The first two was the Cone Nebula and the Rosette. These are particularly deep exposures. This is about 4 hours of H-alpha in 2 panels. One thing about shooting through hydrogen alpha filters is you have to take rather long exposures because you're cutting off most of the visible light except for, in this case, 15 nanometers, which is roughly about 10% of the visible spectrum. So you need very long exposures to get as deep an exposure as in broadband light or visible light. So this one particularly was 4 hours for each panel and 30-minute exposures. Harkens back to the film days. This is the big nebula at the head of Orion, and you can see Betelgeuse and the head stars of Orion over here. But this was a 4-panel mosaic taken with a Pentax 400 millimeter SDUF lens that we stitched together.
Question?
Yes.
Are you going to cover what you use for precision guiding with these?
Okay. We didn't need to guide. At a short focal length, when I get back into this, with this one we were using a separate guide scope. In that earlier picture you saw the camera and a telescope next to it. We were using an STV auto guider and an 80 millimeter achromat lens. So it was doing relatively simple guiding. At really short focal lengths, like what we worked on the large mosaic we'll get into, we actually didn't need to guide. The only reason we did was to dither our exposures to further reduce noise when you stack multiple images. But there were some evenings where he started and programmed and didn't even bother turning on the auto guider. It didn't make a difference at all.
I have a shoestring auto guide.
Yeah? Yeah, those work great too.
Yeah, cheap.
Mm-hmm. So with all these overlapping fields, we eventually settled on a project to capture what's known as the Eridanus loop. That's a obscure nebula below Taurus in Eridanus. That's a large and faint nebulosity. It's known to be associated with the Orion superbubble, basically what the Orion Nebula is part of. Anyway, so at the time we were shooting with an ST11000 and a 7 nanometer Botter H-alpha filter and an 80 millimeter lens. This was, I believe, 4 panels together so far. This is the Eridanus loop that I was mentioning. North is to the left here, so just beyond this area of the field it starts to become Taurus. So it came out pretty good. And though reviewing some of his earlier images before we started doing this project, we still had other overlapping frames. So here's Orion next to it, and this gives you a better perspective of the field here. Right over here is the Orion Nebula M42, and the Horsehead above it, there's that big angelfish, sharpless object again. But you can see how this is all associated, and it seems to emanate from the most active region in the middle. And again, we'll expand further in a moment. Right over here is just on the top are a couple of the stars of the Hyades in Taurus. So eventually, we ended up mosaicing 15 frames together, spanning 4,000 square degrees of the sky. Sounds like a lot, but it's only about 10% of the entire sky. This was our first version, going all the way up through, again, Taurus, and here's the Pleiades. Right over here is the California Nebula, which doesn't look much like California anymore, and Auriga, and all these tiny nebula. With such a large field like this, you start to gain a perspective of looking at these objects. You can really see that this is closest to us, this is a bit further back, and then we get to the really small objects, which are actually in the next arm of the Milky Way out from our location. Down here is the Seagull Nebula. So, and this is, to place that image in perspective, this is it stitched right to the sky. And it's actually stitched to the proper stars in that earlier photograph too. So we were particularly proud of this image in the first place. But, you know, as cameras kept getting better, we went on the next year. Anyway, here's a all-sky panorama with the Mosaic placed in proper perspective also. The background image is courtesy of Tunç Tuzel of Turkey. So, while obviously we weren't the first to map the hydrogen nebulosity in the winter Milky Way, it wasn't particularly inspiring for an amateur project. This is what I was referring to make sure I wasn't making up data when I was stitching everything together. Our mosaic covers this region over here in the Virginia Tech Spectral Line Survey. What's notable about this image, though, is it isn't actually done in visible light. This was taken in radio wavelengths. So where hydrogen alpha also has a strong emission line. Two of the major problems I had assembling these large mosaics were registration of these large frames and light pollution gradients. Dennis's observatory is only about 20 miles outside of Boston and seriously light polluted. Even with a narrow hydrogen alpha filter, you still get light pollution at such a wide angle, because particularly at the edges of the field, you're starting to have an incidence angle where you're actually leaving the bandpass of the filter. So you're entering into that area where light pollution comes through again. Anyway, every wide field image had some inherent distortion problem, and the biggest part is depicting a hemisphere onto a flat surface. For the same reason that you have distorted maps of the world where Greenland looks really huge, that's called a Mercator projection. Yes. So I chose to depict our mosaic here using a rough kind of a Mercator projection in the first place, but I straightened it out because it wasn't a perfect image. Anyway, proper alignment of each frames required specific software for the purpose, and nothing was better than Registar. This program has one purpose, which is to stitch multiple images accurately together. So it can stitch multiple overlapping frames onto a lower resolution wide field one. But without a specialized program to warp all the images to a true Mercator projection, registering 5 adjacent frames adjacent will work fine until you start adding the next rows. So I tried out a free program from Microsoft called Microsoft Ice, and it worked pretty well to put 5 frames lengthwise together, but when I started trying to put the other ones, they wouldn't even go together using this particular program. Registar, however, would accurately distort the frames based on your central position, so that when I put these together, I built from the middle of our region outwards. So for putting that together, we opted to shoot a low-resolution backbone image and then register our larger images, higher resolution images, to that afterwards. It was 9 overlapping frames taken with a 50-millimeter lens, and they were very short, and they didn't have to be particularly pretty. This is for our second attempt at the mosaic, and you can see on the top here I had already started stitching some of the new frames in. I mean, here's a few of the close-ups of the regions before we get going into the big picture of it. Again, here's the California Nebula, and this is after it's distorted to fit into our projection. You can see the square format, which is what you'd normally expect, but then it gets a bit squished. Registrar also occasionally would have a little hiccup putting these together. Here's my star field on LSD. Anyway, so while our first mosaic that I showed you previously wasn't planned in the first place, the second version, the next year, the fall of 2009, we started with an actual goal of doing this. Anyway, our plan was to shoot a 25 frame mosaic with a roughly 85 by 85 degree field of view in a 5 by 5 matrix. Using a 110 millimeter lens, we were able to cover 19 degrees on each frame with centers at each 17 degrees so that we had a little bit of overlap between each of the areas. We planned on doing 4 hours per frame, which we actually got, but the lowest ones which suffered most from horizon creep and light pollution, we ended up gathering an additional 2 hours to smooth out the data. So we had recorded these between October 25th and January 31st of 2010. These are some of our plans and Dennis's notes on what field we had shot and what we hadn't. After we had gone through the data the next day, we had to determine if we had to go back. These red circled ones had like clouds going through or frost on the lens. So we had to reshoot these things. Anyway, and this is what it looked like in his backyard most mornings. This is looking down in Dennis's observatory. And to remind you, there was the auto-guiding camera here with the 80 millimeter lens next to the imaging setup. This is Dennis's rig with the STV and his controller for the mount and his laptop. Anyway, this is what oftentimes the nights looked like. So we'd end up have to reshoot data quite a bit. And this is very frequently what it looked like in the morning. Very moist up in the northeast, and oftentimes we had frost on everything, like this. Hoarfrost is, well, annoying. It's actually very beautiful first thing in the morning.
We'll take your word for that.
Thanks.
Don't try to coil up your cables.
Yeah, I actually cracked a cable once. It was so cold. But anyway, so our final image consists of 23 nights of successful data with 365 20-minute exposures and only 4 hours lost to clouds. 121 hours and 40 minutes of data was actually used in the final image. Dennis was really fond of statistics, so there's a total of 5.9 billion pixels of light in this final image. After getting all the images together, calibrating, combining, and stretching, 12 16 megapixel sub-exposures kind of taxed the limit of my 32-bit operating system. So most of my processing was scripted through MaximDL. What you can do versus other programs is you can have Maxim open up, calibrate, save, and close one image at a time, and then combine them all without having everything open simultaneously and thus running out of RAM on your computer. Here's a few of the selected regions that I was particularly fond of. Right here's the Seagull Nebula, IC 2177, which displays even further extra wings. Actually, it looks more like a bird to me now in a deep exposure. Right over here, that's Thor's helmet, to give you an idea of the scale that we're encompassing. And here's a closer up version of the Thor's helmet. Here's the Hades in Taurus. It's very rare to see this hydrogen nebulosity permeating the field over here. And you'll note there isn't very much hydrogen over by the Pleiades. It's mostly dust in this area, and it's part of I think that's the Taurus superbubble, a Taurus molecular cloud. The dark cloud over here is a little bit of that. Which, by the way, let me go back to that. It's thought that our sun might have been born in that area of the Milky Way. There's a recent article in Sky and Telescope about that, maybe 2 months ago, in search of the birthplace of the sun. Anyway, so here's the California Nebula, Ngc 1499. And it looks more like a scimitar to me on deep exposures. This is the field up in Camelopardalis and Auriga border that has some fairly infrequently imaged nebulosity. Interesting here is this large area here is SH2-209, but this one over here actually has 4 or 5 different sharpless designations, perhaps because it's quite a bit fainter, and thus when Sharpless was compiling his catalog, it wasn't deep enough to actually see that these are all part of one large region. And one of the benefits for wide field projects is they give you new ideas for targets to shoot at longer focal lengths or with deeper exposures. Like, you know, we have this field again. Here's the region above Orion and into Gemini. Over here is Lowers Nebula, which is notable because it was one of the last nebula discovered by amateurs by a father-son imaging team back in the 30s who built their own Schmidt camera and were photographing these regions and discovered this little bugger that still keeps its name to this day. Other things that made me question whether this is a larger part of a larger nebula, so I make notes of these things to go back to later, okay? And I would research these using Simbad, which we'll get to in just a moment. These turned out to be cataloged by the IRS infrared astronomy satellite, which basically mapped the entire sky in infrared wavelengths and assigned numbers to anything that registered on their cameras. Let's see. Here's a close-up of Orion's belt. And, of course, M42. Another way of shooting M42. Yeah, I think I shot it about 20 times myself. Here's the rosette again. And the planetary supernova remnant, Simi's 147. That's in Taurus, by the way. Oh, let me go back for a second. To give you an idea of where this is, here's Simi's 147, and right in this area over here, I believe is M1. Here's IC 405, 410, and 417, and again, Lowers Nebula that I mentioned earlier. This is the lower extremities of Orion into, this is Lepus. You can see right over here, which you'll see right after sunset tonight. It shows you the extent of the nebulosity from Orion, how far this Orion superbubble goes down in the field. So if anyone were considering doing a project like this themselves, I'd suggest shooting at least 25% more data than you intend to use. And because obviously clouds or even horizon creep can affect your output. And plan at least 10% overlap between the frames to avoid those messy gaps and blank spaces. Has anyone ever shot like a mosaic of the moon imaging? You think you get it all and you find you have this one little piece you missed. So this, to give you an idea of the light pollution that we're dealing with, this is a single 20-minute calibrated exposure with the U16, okay? And all that on the bottom is light pollution creeping in, and a little tree. So